Martin Durkin, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Tony.
Now, are you seriously arguing that no government needs to take action to rein in CO2 emissions? The international effort to create a new global agreement on CO2 emissions is a waste of time?
Broadly speaking, yes. I mean, I'm certainly arguing that the evidence is such that we shouldn't take the theory of man-made global warming as proven to be true.
So the US government, the British government, the governments of Canada and Australia, most of the EU governments and their scientific advisors, they're all just wrong and in the thrall of some kind of swindle, is that right?
Yes.
By swindle, are you implying a conscious fraud?
I think there's an element of fraud in the debate, which is that the science is overwhelming. It's done and dusted. We now know for sure this is going on. On the contrary, there is an awful lot of, some of the most basic bits of evidence that you would look to establish the truth of man-made global warming are simply not there.
One of the central arguments in your documentary is about whether or not carbon dioxide levels can cause climate change. Here's what you say.
CO2 forms only a very small part of the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, we measure changes in the level of atmospheric CO2 in tens of parts per million.
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller.
Now, are you actually claiming there that because CO2 is such a small proportion of the atmosphere, that it can't be a climate-forcing agent?
Well, it certainly doesn't mean that it's completely obvious that it should be a climate-forcing agent.
You're not saying that it isn't a climate-forcing agent?
Well, no. I mean, CO2 is a greenhouse gas and, does affect us as other greenhouse gases do. But it's a very small greenhouse gas, and greenhouse gases themselves only form a relatively small part of the Earth's climate system.
Here's how climatologists we spoke to responded to that.
This idea that the amount of something is proportional to how important it is clearly silly. For instance, if I injected you with a little Ebola virus, that's a tiny, tiny amount of something, but it would have an immense impact on you, and you would die. So the amount of something is not in any way proportional to how big an impact it might have, and carbon dioxide's the same.
I mean, the ozone is far less of a concentration in the atmosphere than CO2, but we know the effects of increased UV.
Are you saying they're simply wrong?
Well, if you look closely at even what all climatologists, even on the side of those people who believe in global warming, say, they all admit that the existence of CO2 in the atmosphere is such a that CO2 in the atmosphere is such a small proportion that there need to be some amplifying effect for this small amount of CO2 to have the effects that are being claimed for it.
But the scientists that we spoke to look at this very differently.
The natural sources of carbon dioxide through the breathing of the planet is many, many times the amount of carbon dioxide that human activity produces. But over billions of years, the planet has developed its own mechanisms for taking back up from the atmosphere that amount of carbon dioxide. So there's a natural balance between the breathing in and the breathing out of the planet. What we've done is change that natural balance. By adding significant amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we have upset that natural balance such that we can now observe billions of tons of carbon dioxide accumulating in the atmosphere that we can prove is the result of human activity.
So what do you say to that argument put forward by Andy Pittman and others?
I think it's absolute rubbish. I mean, the number of people who argue that there's some kind of natural equilibrium in the atmosphere and the Earth's climate, it is one of the most absurd ideas, and it's propagated by a lot of people who really ought to know better.
Here's another contentious claim in your film. Again, it's based on the historical record. You claim that the period between the 9th and the 13th centuries was hotter than today. Let's look at that.
Before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era, when temperatures were higher than they are today, a time known to climatologists as the medieval warm period.
Now, do you still stand by that claim?
Yes.
Here's what our climatologists said about that.
When I saw this picture, which shows the medieval warm period warmer than now, and the right-hand side says now, this picture's 20 years old. All the data since then has come off the top.
There is little doubt that the last 5 or 7 years has been warmer than any time in the medieval warm period, and that's what we're absolutely certain about.
So to show a graph that's 20 years out of date, not to show what happened at the end, not to report the reports, that's just a lie.
So the question is, why didn't you use the latest or even the recent IPCC charts?
Because the IPCC charts that they'd like me to use aren't reliable. The reason why we used that was that it was a very famous graph produced by Herbert Lamb, who's
What year was that?
Early 90s, I think.
Why did you use a graph that was 17 years old when you could have used more modern data which shows what's happened in that past 17 years?
Well, firstly, if you look at what's happened in the past 17 years, you don't find a huge change. I mean, we've got to get this thing in perspective. When we're talking about temperature change in the past... No, hold on. When you're talking about the temperature change in the past 150 years, you're talking about a temperature change of just over ½ degree Celsius in a very noisy record where the error bars are very considerable. So when you talk about temperature change in the past 20 years, you're talking, in terms of our knowledge of the climate history of the last 1,000 years, of a very tiny amount of change. I'd love to...
We have a very accurate knowledge of it because the instruments are almost perfect. We know exactly what temperature rises there have been in the past 17 years.
That's very untrue. We don't have a very accurate knowledge of it at all. We had a huge problem at the end of the Soviet Union that they closed a lot of their temperature reading stations.
17 years ago we had an accurate knowledge and now we don't. Well, I have a very simple question about your use of this graph because it says it's a chart of the temperature over 1,000 years right up to now. Now, to me, means 2007. But in fact, this graph doesn't go anywhere near 2007, does it?
Well, I mean, you can't just get a graph that's produced by Herbert Lamb on the various statistics and then add another bit of line to it.
I just want to get you to answer this question, why you said now when it isn't now.
Well, that's what the IPCC does. It refers to, years before now. I mean, in terms
goes up
of
to what, 90?
In terms of
90.
In terms of the error bars of that graph, it is absurd to quibble on the when it finishes in terms of tens of dates.
Well, it's not absurd because the 1990 graph, IPCC 1990 graph you used, was superseded in the second IPCC report in 1995, in the third in 2001, in the fourth in 2007. Why didn't you use one of those?
I'll tell you exactly why we didn't use one of those. They were superseded by graphs which eliminated the medieval warm period. If you look at the old picture of the last 1,000 years, there's the medieval warm period, it goes down to the Little Ice Age and then up again. I'm trying to do that backwards so that people can understand. What it was replaced with was something which became known as the hockey stick, because it looks like a hockey stick, because it goes trundling along the bottom and then comes up in a manner which looks more alarming than if it just sort of dips and then comes up again.
It is alarming because it shows a rapid rise in temperature from 1990 to 2007.
Which is why scientists then looked at the hockey stick to see, because it contradicted every other sort of set of data we had for the last 1,000 years.
By saying now in the graph, you've left yourself open to the charge that you've deliberately misrepresented the graph and that you've left out 17 years of growing temperatures which don't prove your point.